So let me introduce our speaker today, Lisa Hicknell. She is with the Waterloo, I'm going to make a mess of this, Waterloo Board. And she has been teaching for many years and has presented for OHASTA before. Last year, she presented at our conference, Ongoing Gradeless. So we look forward to all the great things you have to offer to us today, Lisa. And I will turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I'm just going to start with a territorial acknowledgement. The territory from which I'm speaking today, I'm where that little purple marker is on the screen, Elmira, Ontario. And this territory is part of the Haldimand Tract, most recently the territory of the Haudenosaunee, but through history has been home to the Neutral and continues to be home to the Anishinaabe. I acknowledge the ways of knowing and being that I as a settler have benefited from as a result of their presence on this land. I also acknowledge the land defenders who are currently working in this area to reclaim and protect this land. As we approach Orange Shirt Day on Wednesday, I acknowledge how education has been used as a weapon against Indigenous peoples on this land and how we as educators can work toward using it to reconcile past harms. So as Vanessa said, I'm currently working as a consultant in the Teaching and Learning Division of the Waterloo Region District School Board. As of last October, I started in that role. Prior to that, I had been teaching history for about 19 years at Grand River Collegiate Institute. You can see there how to reach out to me through Twitter or through email if there's anything you want to explore further that I mentioned during this presentation today. So today we're going to be talking about pandemic planning, how we can rethink our curricular priorities and assessment for the 2020-2021 school year. While these things may be a little bit more pressing during this school year, the things I'm going to touch on today really do serve as some good ways to reflect on our pedagogy and assessment, even when we're not facing these unusual times. So we just wanted to start out with a poll today to get a sense of everyone in the audience and what teaching looks like for them this year. So we'd like to know, we have two separate questions. First, what system are you teaching under this year? And secondly, what class type are you teaching under this year? So we want to know if you're in a quadmester, octomester, a term system, a semester, and then also if you're full face-to-face, hybrid, distance learning, e-learning. So Vanessa, I think, is going to release those polls. So let's see, it looks like the majority of people are in a quadmester system. We don't have anyone with us doing that crazy octomester. So most are in quadmester, some are in semester, most are hybrid, and then we have a couple full return as well as full distance. Oh, and then we've got other. I'm curious if you're in that other, put that in the chat because I'd like to know what your situation is.
Okay.
Okay, so I think we can close that down, Vanessa. So really, what it all comes down to, regardless of the type of system that you are operating under this year, the reality is you can't do what you've always done. Here in the Waterloo Region District School Board, we're following a quadmester schedule, and it's split between some students are in a hybrid model, others are full distance learning. And what we know with the quadmester schedule, at least, is that students are experiencing about 5% less instructional time with their teachers. But we also know for those students who are learning at a distance, either all of the time or some of the time, that they may require up to 4 times as long to work through learning activities when they're at a distance. So that means we can't do what we've always done in our history and social science classes. And some of you, if you started out this year trying to do what you've always done, you may have already realized that it may not work the way you had hoped. So a successful year is going to require that you rethink how you teach, what you teach, and how you assess. So some tips for how you can figure all of this out in this crazy time. First thing you need to do is establish curricular priorities. If you know you can't do it all, how are you going to decide what to do? Well, the first thing I'll tell you is what you shouldn't do. You don't want to engage in what Catlin Tucker has referred to as the Swiss cheese approach of curriculum planning. What that means is a teacher would just pick and choose from what they normally do and give those little bits and pieces to their students and hope that it all makes sense by the end. Unfortunately, this generally leads to a lack of clarity and cohesion. What we really need to do is go back to the beginning and re-examine the course as a whole. So for teachers in Ontario, going back to the beginning and looking at the course as a whole means we go to our curriculum documents. So that means looking at our overall expectations. What we want to do is clarify what are our curricular standards and what are our content standards. Curricular standards refer to those skills, strategies, and processes that span our entire discipline, while our content standards are the specific knowledge expectations that come with our specific course code. So you want to try and focus on teaching your students to apply those curricular standards and think like a historian or a social scientist or a lawyer. What are the thinking processes that they need to be able to do the discipline? From there, think about the content expectations that will help them learn those processes. So we want to think about this for a few minutes. We'll see how well you know your curriculum. So Vanessa's going to share the link for a Jamboard in the chat. And what we'd like you to do is jump into it. I think there's 4 different sheets. So if one is too busy, jump into another one. And choose a sticky, and then on that sticky, I'd like you to record at least one of your curricular standards in one of the courses you teach, whether it be Canadian and World Studies or Social Sciences and the Humanities. And on that sticky, put down one of your curricular standards and then drag it over to whether it's Canadian and World Studies or Social Sciences. Oh, shoot, sorry. So just as an example of that shift from prioritizing the content standards to prioritizing the curricular standards, here's something I would have traditionally done in my CHC classroom. I would have said, okay, I'm going to teach this content standard of World War I, and I'm going to ask the question, to what extent did Canada's participation in World War I contribute to Canada's independence? But if I'm prioritizing the curricular standards, I might reframe that to this new approach where I'm going to focus on the inquiry process. And I'm instead going to ask the question, to what extent did Canada's role in global events make the country stronger or weaker? Now that may not seem like a big shift, but if I'm crunched for time and I'm taking that new approach, what I've done is gone from, in the traditional approach, addressing 2 overall expectations to, in the new approach, addressing, parenting and working from home. Sorry, could you go back upstairs now and see Abby? To addressing up to 5 different expectations, depending on what events the students choose to explore. Poppy, I need you to go upstairs right now, please. The next thing that you can do is embrace a thematic approach. And I know that not long ago, there was a webinar that was done on teaching CHC this year, and they explored that thematic approach a little bit. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time with that, but I will say just a few things. In approaching the course from a thematic rather than chronological perspective, if you're looking at a history course, you can explore a variety of time periods or topic areas within a single theme and/or across the course. So you can still make sure you're hitting on all those required time periods, even though you may not be addressing them chronologically. And if you're doing that, you can still, and you should still provide some sort of chronological context. So things that I've seen being done in this sense is in the past with my class, we would have a collaborative class timeline. If we were in the physical classroom, it might be up on a bulletin board. It could also be created in the digital environment. Or I know that some teachers, shout out to Ian Duncan, who I learned about this on Twitter from him, is doing chrono themes. So he's blending themes and chronology at the same time in his CHC course. And most importantly, we have to become okay with letting go. We have to let go with the concern that students need to have a shallow understanding of a whole lot of events or topics in our courses, and be okay with them having a more in-depth understanding of fewer topics. Letting go is really hard because we're all passionate about our subject area. That's why we're teachers, and that's why we're teaching in this specific area. But we need to be able to let go of some of those content pressures that we often put on ourselves. Something else we can do as we're reviewing what we're teaching during this pandemic is make what we're teaching relevant. Ask yourself how you might connect your curriculum to the Black Lives Matter movement, land defenders, debates over monuments and the naming of institutions and streets, for example. Now, I do want to provide one caution. When exploring current events, please make sure you're doing so through a trauma-informed lens. Some students in our classes have closer, more emotional connections to some of these topics. And so we want to be cognizant of that. That doesn't mean you should avoid them. Just approach them in a way that is being sensitive to student experiences, feelings, and perspectives. Something else that you could do, and this question came up, again, Twitter, it's where I find some of the best ideas. Last week, Samantha Cutrera posted a video where she asked, how might you invite your students to bring their own histories and experiences into the classroom? Doing so with compassion, complexity, and care. And so this goes beyond, you know, having the all about me bulletin board type thing, but really having students dig deeper into their own family histories and how they connect to Canadian history, perhaps, and how they may challenge the narrative that we traditionally teach in those courses. The benefit of making the content relevant is that it's going to help build engagement and help students see the relevance of our courses in their lives. So another little participation. I'd like to discuss ways you've woven current events into your course this year. And if you haven't had a chance to weave any in yet, how might you do that if you had the opportunity? So I think Vanessa has created some breakout groups for us. Okay. Thanks, everyone. I hope you had some, were able to share some ideas and maybe pick up some new ideas from that conversation. Sometimes I wish I could be a fly in the wall in all the breakout rooms, but I will trust that there were some good things going on there. So once you know where you're going, how are you going to know if you got there? That brings us to conversations about assessment. I love this quotation from Caitlin Tucker. I've been sharing it with so many teachers since the spring. When students are asked questions that can be Googled, teachers shouldn't be surprised when students Google them. So ask yourself, are those the types of questions I'm asking my students, or are we aiming for something a little bit different? There's that quotation I was just referring to, that when they're asked questions that can be Googled, we shouldn't be surprised when students Google them. So let's try and think about some non-Googleable approaches to planning assessment. So when planning assessment, some considerations that you should keep in mind. First, is what you're planning going to be engaging for students? We know that engagement is key, especially when our students are at home some or all of the time during our instructional time. So we want things that are engaging. We want to make sure that the data we're collecting in terms of our assessment data is accurate. Is it actually reflecting student achievement, or is it reflecting other things? Is it relevant? Does the assessment piece reflect what is really important to the course? Can it be connected to those overall expectations, to those curricular and content standards? The example I love to give here is, for years, we always did in our history department the World War I trench letter. And the way we had it set up at our school, and we did it for years and years and years, we never asked why we were doing it. But once I looked at the curriculum and looked at the way we had set up this letter, it actually didn't have any relevance to the curriculum itself in terms of meeting any overall expectations. So when that's the case, you either have to ditch it or you have to adapt it so that it actually is relevant to what's important in your course. And equitable. Does your assessment practice meet diverse student learning needs? Or are you asking all students to do all the same thing in all the same way? Because if that's the case, you're setting the bar too high for some students and too low for others. And so we'll talk about some things that you can do to make your assessment practices a bit more equitable. Number one is offering choice. So how do you offer choice? Well, this is how I did it in my class. I built success criteria around the demonstration of curricular and content expectations. Once I had set those criteria and shared them with the students, then I gave the students the agency to determine how they chose to meet that criteria. So I'd select a criteria, 1 or 2, say this is what we're working on right now, create some sort of inquiry question that aligned with the content criteria, and then they used the curricular criteria to answer that question. And how they met the criteria was entirely up to them. They got to choose the form when it came to showing what they knew about that expectation. Why offer choice? You're going to meet the needs of diverse learners by reducing construct irrelevant barriers. Those are those barriers to students really being able to share what they know about a topic, but they're barriers that don't have to do with what we're assessing. So for example, if a student struggles with writing, they're not going to do well on a written test simply because they can't write the words out coherently, not because they don't understand the expectations. For others, it's timed assessments and their anxiety levels go up. And when their anxiety levels are up, their brain can't recall the information that they may need. So we want to avoid those construct irrelevant barriers. And by allowing students to direct how they show what they know, it's going to increase their engagement because they're choosing to approach those expectations in a way that is interesting for them. And also, if students are all approaching the expectations in different ways, the academic integrity of what they produce is going to go up. It's when we're having all students do the same thing in the same way that we run into more issues of academic dishonesty. If you're not ready to quite hand over all control by just presenting the expectations and letting students go from there, there's some really great ways to offer choice, but still maintaining some control by setting some parameters. So this is just one example of a choice board that was put together by Catlin Tucker. And so it offers some different options for how students can show what they know. Cornelius Minor, in an article I just read this week, said the assignment doesn't matter. The learning outcome does. We have to let go of our obsession with certain types of sharing knowledge in our courses. Don't get me started on the 5-paragraph essay because I'll go on a long rant, but that's just one of the things that we need to not obsess over so much and give students some other options on how they share their learning. Another great strategy is to have students make their learning public. So require that whatever demonstrations of learning happen in your classroom, they be made available in some way for class-wide or public consumption. Why would you do this? Well, first of all, if students are going to cover fewer topics but in greater depth, this will broaden student knowledge of the course content because they'll benefit from the learning that their classmates have done. It also adds authenticity and relevance to the work they're doing, again, increasing those engagement levels. So we're going to do a brief brainstorm of some ways that your students might make their learning public, even if they're at a distance. So how could they share what they've learned if they're not in the physical classroom together? I would like you, now don't do anything until I say go. I would like you to type one idea about how students may make their learning public at a distance into the chat, but don't press enter until I say go. This is a strategy you can use with your students. So give them a little think time, let them record an answer in the chat, and then I'm going to give you a 3, 2, 1, press enter. For some reason, I can't even see the chat. Someone who can see the chat, Vanessa, can you share out some of their ideas that have come up?
Sorry, I was on mute. So some of the information was a history fair, speed dating, Flipgrid, share work on the slideshow or share the docs, a series of social media posts, which is very cool. Petition the virtual school administration to have a space for student products on the school website.
Yes. Oh, that's a great idea. Awesome. I just threw some up here. I love the ones that you hit on that I didn't even think about. Those are awesome. But some other things you could do: a Google Slides gallery walk, a Google Sites page. So if the administrator won't let you put it on the school website, create your own website. If you're in the D2L VLE, you could present information through the discussion thread and allow students to comment on it. Virtual meeting presentations, a class YouTube channel, a Jamboard where students put the results of their learning on one screen, one slide of a Jamboard, and students can comment on it with the sticky notes. Flipgrid, which was mentioned, Seesaw, the activity feed. So lots of ways that students can still make their learning public, even though they're not in a classroom together. Or if they are in a classroom together, ways that they can do it where they're safely distancing from one another. Lower the stakes. A recent study by Stanford University showed that over 70% of students are stressed about the amount of work they have, about how they're doing in that work, about their overall school achievement. Then when we layer on top of that COVID-19, we have many students who are concerned about their family's health, their family situation, financial uncertainty. And so our students are feeling a great deal of stress right now. We also know that stress interferes with our students' ability to process new information and recall prior knowledge. So if we really want to prioritize learning in our classrooms, we need to do whatever we can to minimize student stress. So some ways to do that. Ditch or de-emphasize high stakes assessments in your classroom. High stakes assessments are those timed, memory-based, stress-inducing, heavily weighted types of assessments. They present lots of construct irrelevant barriers, often leave little room for nuance in the answers, and encourage, because of the stress they induce, encourage academic dishonesty. We also need to increase our reliance on assessment data that comes out of observations and conversations. What I tell teachers that I work with is assess like a kindergarten teacher. They don't have great big projects and they don't have exams. They are constantly assessing by what they see students doing during the learning process. And we can do the same thing in our classrooms. Prioritize active learning during your synchronous learning time, and just find a way that works for you to make little notes, little comments about what you see and what you hear as your students are working through the learning. Blur the lines between formative and summative. Growing Success itself says it doesn't matter what the assessment piece is. It doesn't need to be and shouldn't be labeled as formative or summative. What matters is what you do with the information. Do you use the information you gather from an assessment piece formatively by shifting your instruction to help students move ahead? Or do you use it summatively because a student shows that they got it? And now you have a good, reliable way to say that they understand that piece. Or when you come to the end of an instructional period, if you have to do reports, for example. We really need to break that habit of announcing that learning activities are formative or summative at the outset. Because aside from diagnostic pieces, no learning activity should be categorized before it's completed. What might be formative for one student might be summative for another. A lot of teachers think that having the same sources of assessment data for all of their students is what's fair, but it really isn't equitable, because some students require multiple opportunities to demonstrate proficiency, while others will get it quickly. And so those who get it shouldn't have to continue working on the same expectation, but those who don't deserve multiple opportunities to improve. So when a student asks, does this count? Or is this formative? The answer should be everything counts, as it offers us more information about how and what you're learning. The less information you provide, the less we know about how your learning is progressing. Which brings me to the idea of going gradeless. And I could talk all day just on this, but I'm going to keep it really brief in the interest of time. Compared to those who receive feedback alone, studies show that students who receive grades alone demonstrate poor achievement and lower optimal motivation than those who receive just feedback. They also reveal a disproportionately negative impact on students who are struggling academically. So sometimes we think by putting a low grade on an assessment piece, that's really going to give those students a kick in the butt and they're going to work harder. It's actually the reverse that's true. When students who are already struggling see those lower grades, it demotivates them and it shuts them down. Therefore, it's actually the students who most need our support that are most harmed by grades. It may surprise people to know, but grades are not a necessary part of the learning process. Yes, in Ontario, the ministry dictates we report grades a few times a year, but that doesn't mean they have to be reported outside of those report card times. The more they can be de-emphasized, the better off our students will be. So what are some things you can do to ditch or de-emphasize grades? Shift all conversations back to the learning. And I have a little example conversation on the screen there. When a student says, will this count? Everything you do provides evidence about your learning. Yeah, but how much really is it going to be worth? Let's wait and see what the evidence tells us before we decide how reflective it is of your achievement. Delay or eliminate the grade and focus on that feedback that highlights the learning. So that may mean you're still recording a grade in your own markbook if that's how you're most comfortable, or if your administration requires it, but that doesn't mean those numbers, letters, or levels have to go on the student's work. All they really need to see is that feedback, and that feedback, if it is well structured, will tell everything students need to know about where they are and where they need to go. Think about co-curating learning portfolios with your students to track evidence of their learning according to the overall expectations in your course. That means students get to decide, hey, this is something I'm really proud of. I think it shows a lot of growth. I'm going to put that in my portfolio. Meanwhile, you're putting your observations, details about your conversations, and other reflections on student learning that you have in the portfolio as well. So it's completely transparent between you and your students. And then once you create those learning portfolios, think about determining a report card grade in collaboration with your students. Assessment was never supposed to be done to our kids. It's supposed to be done with. The word actually means along, sitting alongside. It should be with our students. So look at the trends in the evidence that you've collected, whether in a learning portfolio or somewhere else, and say, what is the trend telling us about your achievement? Rather than averaging points and weighting everything and getting all hung up on that, have a conversation with the student and determine where they are together. Here's a little mind-blowing comment for some people, but think about this. A student-teacher conference discussing the evidence in the portfolio in relation to the overall expectations and establishing a report card grade can be a substitute for a high-stakes course culminating assessment, such as an exam. I know people are already stressing about what will exams look like in this atmosphere. Well, what if you just got rid of them? I know that's what I did. I used my exam days to schedule appointments with students to determine what their report card grade would be. So it is possible. It's being done all over the country, all over the globe. This gradeless shift is taking over. So be open to considering some of those ideas as you assess during a pandemic, and you never know, they might just carry through with you after all of this is over. So that's all I've got for now. I'm welcome to address, or I'm inviting you to ask any questions or offer any comments that you'd like. I think Vanessa, would it be appropriate to stop sharing the screen at this point? Okay.
Absolutely. So in the chat, we have a thank you. I want to thank you. That was very enlightening and shed some light on, you know, this new style of learning that we're having to participate in. So are there any other questions for Lisa? You can turn your mic on.
If you are interested in anything else, like about learning portfolios or specifically about going gradeless, I still have the slides that I shared at the OHASTA in-person conference last year, which I'm happy to share out. I'll put in my info there. So on Twitter, I'm at Hicknell, and then my email is lisahicknell@wrdsb.ca. Feel free to reach out if you'd like any of those resources. So I see Rachel's asked about examples of learning portfolios. So if you are in the D2L VLE world, it has a really powerful portfolio tool embedded within it. When I was in the classroom, I didn't use it though. I used Seesaw, and it was awesome for high school portfolios because it was the ultimate transparency, because students could access it and parents could also see it. I have never had such low numbers at parent-teacher night as I did when I was using Seesaw, because parents knew everything that was happening with their kids in my class every single day. They didn't need to come to parent-teacher interviews. You can also use Google Slides. Slides Mania has created some awesome templates that you could use for student portfolios in Google Slides. So lots of opportunities for portfolios.
Good afternoon, Ms. Hicknell. Thank you for this presentation.
Sure.
This is a question that I continue to ask history teachers all the time because the implications of it make me a little bit uneasy. So I am definitely not a teacher who's obsessed with the coverage of specific detail and every single specific expectation, because the history curriculum is completely overrun with specific expectations. But I am concerned about, like, you know, if we go back to Samantha Cutrara's trifecta of complexity, care, and I forget what the third one is.
Compassion.
Compassion, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But all of those three things take time and reflection. And say if you are me and you have 7 weeks to assess and evaluate the history curriculum, at what point is the compression of 100 years of history too much in terms of evaluation of the overall expectations?
Right. That's a really good question. I think, like, I have to go back to, first of all, I think there is way too much. Like, yes, there's covering 100 years is kind of bonkers. And yes, thanks, Jan, CHW has a lot more than that. And that's where it becomes really important to focus on those curricular priorities. Because if we can teach kids to understand things like, how do you assess historical significance? Why is historical perspective important when we're looking at topics? Like, if we can teach them how to do history, then when they are adulting and coming across events that are presented in the media, for example, they'll be able to stop and think, hold on, what might the other perspectives of this event have been? Why was it significant or was it not significant? Where is some of those pieces of continuity that is weaving all this history together? So I think that's really where, you know, we need to let go of that content if we know that we are creating historical thinkers in our students. So.
Thank you. That does put me at ease, because the plan that I had to slap together at the very last minute for this class, 7-week history course, is we're going to assess how students are applying one historical thinking concept per week for 4 weeks. And then last 3 weeks, we're going to try combining them in response to the post-World War II time periods, which is more recent and will therefore hopefully feel more relevant to their experiences.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great idea. And again, I think given the compressed timelines of this year, we have to be okay with that. Like, maybe that wouldn't be ideal if we were in a regular semester schedule, but that's going to be good enough in these compressed timelines. And I think all teachers have to just forgive themselves, right? To allow yourself to be okay with that. It doesn't make you a bad teacher if you don't hit all of those, you know, big shiny historical events. Kids will be okay.
Yeah, can I just jump in here? One of the things that I always said is, like, you know, what do we want my grade 10 students to know when they're finished? Like, you know, if this is the last history course they ever take, like, I want them to be able to talk about history, like, in their lives, and, like, look at the news or other kinds of evidence, and, like, you know, be able to make some kind of sense of them and understand a little bit about, you know, how we got here, but, like, be able to speak to things and have an opinion. Like, those are kind of the core things. And, like, you don't need to know 100,000 things to be able to do that.
What I would add is that if they can Google it, chances are they don't need to know it. It's better if they can think about the material around them, right? Again, current events and how those have come to pass over time.
Thank you. I think my approach to the knowledge mark is going to be like, there's like, I'm both scaffolding the knowledge and you have Google. Like this is a virtual class. Like you should, I am expecting level 4s for knowledge because it's there. Unless we're talking about fake news, in which case we have to be a little bit more careful.
Absolutely.
Are there any more questions before we head out for the evening? Okay. Well, thank you again, Lisa. That was great. Fantastic to see you again, and fantastic to see some of the rest of you back at our webinars.
Awesome. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
All right. Have a good night.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in here before everybody leaves. Our conference registration is going to be open soon, so watch for that email in your inbox, maybe end of this week, beginning of next week. So it'll be virtual, and we're looking forward to seeing as many of you as can make it.
Yeah,